If you like to make your NFL games a little bit more interesting, you've come to the right place. It's the Even Money Podcast with Ross Tucker and Steve Fezzik.
Yeah, Vegas, baby, Vegas. It is the Even Money Podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings Sportsbook. Love those guys. Love those of you that use the glorious code ROSS anytime you're doing anything over on the DraftKings Sportsbook. You know, when people ask, well, how do you have one of the best betting podcasts in the world? Why do you have such a popular NFL betting podcast? I give you Exhibit A, okay? I give you this episode where we literally have one of the best professional bettors who's ever lived, who has decidedly and has evidence of moving markets with the premier, and I don't say that lightly, premier information researcher in the NFL stratosphere, and we have them both on the same show at the same time. I'm talking, of course, about my every week co-host Steve Fezzik at Fezzik Sports and only at Fezzik Sports on social media. And the man that I gotta be honest with you, I lost track of all the jobs he has and everything he's going. I know I can't wait till the summer when I get the season preview. I'm talking, of course, about Warren Sharp at Sharp Football on social media. Check me out at Ross Tucker NFL. Check us out at Ross Tucker Pod. Means a great deal. Those of you that rate and review the show on any podcast app or you watch on YouTube more and more every week, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. Steve, great to see you as always. Warren, I look forward to this every year. I think it's the first episode after the NFL schedule comes out. Thank you once again for making time for us.
Absolutely. I love breaking it down with you. I love that you bring on Mike North, which, by the way, I got to see him for the first time last week when I saw him on your show. So great interview with him. He seems like a great guy. I think honestly, though, his hands are being tied. He's being given an edict of what the league wants to have happen with the schedule. And so he's following suit with that. But there are some concerning things with this year's schedule, as well as the direction that we seem to be heading as it relates to rest. And I'm sure we're going to dive into all of that.
Without question, before we do that, Warren, give us the current breakdown of the different places people can find you, when the preview will come out, how people can get their hands on that. I know you just published a crazy long article about all the scheduling stuff. Just so you know, Warren, I went for a walk. I popped in my Ray-Kun earbuds. I have this app that reads articles to me, and I listened to the whole thing, man. I was all over all the Ravens plus 16 and the Niners minus 21 and all of that stuff. So just give me the breakdown before we dive into the numbers of where people can find you these days.
Yeah, so sharpfootballanalysis.com is where I'm going to be sharing the article that we wrote. You can go read the whole thing. It's like 18 pages in Word before I sent it to my editor. And then if you want to get all the details, we're going to be talking about a lot of these rest edges. If you want to get all the details of all the teams and their rest edges, specifically on a game-by-game basis, which I think is very valuable and can be useful from a betting perspective, that is part of my 2024 football preview book, which is over 500 pages. And you can get that right now on Early Bird up at sharpfootballanalysis.com. But I decided to do something because I'm talking about it a little bit here over the next few days. It's only going to be $5. It's regularly $30. I'll give you a code. If you enter the code NFL Book, it'll only be $5. And I'm doing that just because I want more people to get this book, check it out. It's not as much about turning a profit as it is getting this information out to people. So that'll bring the cost all the way down to $5. You can pick it up. It goes on. It's pre-sale now. It'll be published at the very beginning of July.
Yeah, so Warren is a liar. Warren's basically doing the drug dealer move, where he gives it to you for $5 because once you have this thing, you'll have to have it every year for the rest of your life.
Let's hope so.
So I love the strategy, Warren. I love it. It's awesome. So let's start, Warren, with this. And I guess before we even get into the specific numbers that you found, two things I would say. One is, you got to admit, Warren and Steve, I don't know if you listened or watched the interview on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast with Michael North, the VP of Broadcast Planning for the NFL. But I specifically asked him about Warren Sharp, And the NFL is well aware of Warren Sharp, well aware of the rest disparity, rest disadvantage, which I think is interesting, Warren, and maybe your point that they know about it and they still, at least in your mind, didn't do anything about it or even went the opposite way.
Yeah, look, I think they're aware of it, and it's gotten worse the last couple of years. There are more and more games being played right now. This season, there's 101 games that are being played that have a rest disparity. Out of 272, 101, one team has a rest edge over another. That set a record. We have the number one largest rest edge of any team, the number one largest of the last decade. That's the Baltimore Ravens at plus 16. But I won't dive into all the details, but what I will say is that they're aware of it, but the arguments that he brought up were very convincing on the surface because he just looked back at what net rest edge showed last year. And I don't know if you want me to dive into the breakdown, but
I will say this, Warren. I remember last year when we talked about it, you were very concerned about the Niners, you were very concerned about the Chiefs, and you were very concerned about the Eagles, and that's what he brought up.
Yep.
So, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but I've also read what you wrote. I guess what he is saying is that he doesn't believe the cumulative. He feels like that's proof that the cumulative rest disadvantage is not a big factor. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I disagree because those teams are some of the best. If you looked at who's favored to win the NFC before the season, it's the 49ers. Who's favored to win the AFC? It was the Chiefs. And so the fact that they overcame, and that was with the schedule being known, they were still the betting favorites. So the fact that they still made it there isn't necessarily to me that, oh my God, rest doesn't matter at all. More so what I was looking at is on the games that they had rest disadvantages, you could see a night and day difference for a team like the Kansas City Chiefs. It's one of the reasons I was on the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. It's because they finally had 2 weeks to take off and rest up before that game. That's not what, like the primary reason, but it was a factor in my opinion. When you look at the Chiefs, when they had a rest deficit of 2+ days, they went 1-4 ATS last year. And I like using ATS. I'll also share straight up, but ATS takes into market expectations before kickoff. So it takes all that into consideration. I think it's a better measure. Are you exceeding expectations or falling short of expectations? They're 1-4 ATS, whereas when they don't have a rest as an issue at all, they're 80%. They're 12-3 ATS. San Francisco 49ers, similar thing. They are 1-3 ATS when rest was an issue for them last year. But when it was not, they're covering 58% of their games. They're going 9-3 straight up. So the Philadelphia Eagles, the last one, just because it's easy to throw in there. I was especially concerned they had a -6 day net rest edge last year. That was offset by 3 particular games that were causing them problems. They played 3 straight games in a row where they were at a rest deficit in all of those 3 games. And they got smoked in 2 of the games. They lost 42-19 and 33-13 in 2 of those games when they were just dogs of 3 to 3.5 points. And the game that they were favored by 3 points, they were losing by 10 in the 4th quarter. They were losing in overtime. It took a 59-yard field goal with seconds left to send the game to overtime. And then they were still losing in overtime. They went 0-2-1 ATS in those games. So it's small sample size because there aren't a ton of these games. My point, I guess, is that if the best of the best, the very best teams in the NFL are able to win enough games when there's no rest issue, but are struggling when there is rest, that could be an indication that like even average teams or bad teams are probably going to struggle a lot with rest as well. And we see that on a game-by-game basis also. So I find that it's more where rest from a cumulative perspective is more impactful is later on in the season, couple games in a row, boom, you definitely want to factor it in there. But I like looking at it on a game-by-game basis, and we've discussed this on the show last year. I've got the numbers in the article this year. Whether you look at the last 2 to 3 years and you want to look at every single game where there's a rest advantage, right around 55% ATS for over 100 game sample size. That's a very measurable, impactful statistic that I know the league might say, oh, 55%, that's not that convincing. But Steve sure as hell knows that if you're betting on basically one factor and it's covering 55% over 100 games, it's impactful. And then you zoom out, you look at late season where rest is an issue. especially over the last decade to boost up the sample size, you're like 56%. So rest is, in my opinion, he said that we can't really measure it. He said it because we can't really measure it from their numbers, it doesn't really seem to be very impactful. But I'm looking at betting data and I am saying that you can measure it. And that maybe for a full game like the Kansas City Chiefs, it's convenient that they, the best team in the NFL had one of the worst situations and they still ended up winning the Super Bowl. So that's great. But in those games that they did have the rest disadvantages, they absolutely struggled as compared to the games they did not.
Steve, when I hear Warren talking, my thought is when I hear those ATS numbers for the Chiefs and the Niners and the Eagles, why is that not being built more into the spread? I would think Warren has this data. We know what the spread is now for every game the whole year. And even as we get closer to those games, I'm surprised, given Warren's rest advantage data, that these are still the spreads in these games. Is it because the books just don't take into account?
So a whole lot to comment on. Give me 2 minutes here. First off, the Niners, Philly, and KC basically met expectations. All of them were lined around 11 wins. 2 of them won 11. 1 of them won 12. So it's so close to the mean, it's inconclusive. And other factors certainly apply. What's interesting is, so Warren's data shows these teams that have a rest disadvantage have done poorly against the spread. I checked with RJ. So RJ Bell ran the numbers in his database that he ran, said, if running all games, he went back like 10 years, that it was basically 50-50. But that does not mean it's not disadvantageous. Because I do think, and I know that Vegas, especially on the closing numbers, it does take into consideration these rest disadvantages. And so if a team would normally be laying 3, if they're having a net 36-hour rest disadvantage, oftentimes they're only laying 2. It's not a huge difference. It might be 2.5. But there is a difference somewhat in the market. I think one easy way to measure this is always just going forward to take a look at it. But to have the NFL say, well, it wasn't conclusive last year, that's the ultimate punt. Any team's going to say, give me the rest advantage. It has to have an advantage. And RJ's numbers did show over the cumulative, over the season, teams actually, they oftentimes get up for these rest disadvantage games. And oftentimes it's the other games where the cumulative effect, as Warren has mentioned, wears on a team and they don't do well against the spread. Historically, the teams that are the biggest rest disadvantage, it's not a huge number, but it is a number.
I want to get to you in a sec. Warren, I want to get to you in 1 second. I need to make sure everyone knows there's only one Father's Day gift out there. It's Omaha Steaks, because a world-class dad deserves a world-class steak. Here's what's crazy. They've got hand-selected gift packages starting at just $89. So just go to omahasteaks.com and use promo code EVEN at checkout for an additional discount when you shop gourmet gift packages for Father's Day. Nobody knows what to get their dad. This is what you get your dad. And you say, I'm going to come over. I'm going to grill with you. Pick from premium proteins like juicy pork chops, air-chilled chicken, beefy burgers. Use promo code EVEN to get an exclusive savings. Shop for unforgettable gifts guaranteed to make Dad's day. That's omahasteaks.com. Promo code EVEN at checkout to save on exclusive packages starting at just $89. And you got to have something to wash it down. You know how we do it on the Even Money podcast. We drink Labatt Blue Light with Fezzik, with Warren, with anybody, with our friends, living life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. Warren, I know you got 2 things. I'm hoping this is one of them. I know your database in some levels goes back to 1990. I know the NFL is basically saying it's not actionable because look how well the Niners and Chiefs did. You're pointing out how these teams were ATS and rest disadvantage games last year. Talk to me about 5 years, Warren. Talk to me about 10 years. Talk to me about every team that's disadvantaged, not just the couple we're mentioning. Give me a larger sample size.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can share that. The one thing I wanted to mention to Steve is that I have found it's not the 1 day rest disadvantage that one day different that matters as much as it is 3 days. So when you look at teams that have 3 days or more of a rest advantage, that's when it really becomes a factor. And I think there, if you go back, your 10 years, which is some of the data that I was sharing here, it is actionable. It is meaningful. Over the last 10 years, where's my number? Over the last 10 years, teams are 69, 53, and 3 ATS. That's 56%, 56.6%. When they have a rest advantage of 3 days or more from week 13 onward, so late in the season. And if you look over the course of the entire season, with a 3 day or more rest advantage over the last 3 years, you're still at 55%. So again, if you remove the 1 or 2 days, which there's oftentimes 1 day here, 1 day there, doesn't end up being as big of a factor. 3 days is what I have found to be the sweet spot where you want to look at a little bit more closely. So that's one thing that I had, and it answers your question as well, Ross. The other thing is just to kind of tie the bow on one of the things that Mike said, Mike North. He said these three things. We try to maximize viewership, maximize fan interest, and minimize competitive inequalities. And he said that on your show. And I think he's right. And he did it in that exact order. So in other words, that's what the league is trying to do. That is the order of preference that they've probably been handed down. I think at one point in time, they were trying to be more balanced. And my data shows that we did not have as egregious haves and have-nots in the same year. But lately, we've gotten to a point where their main focus, especially after seeing what happened with the Peacock game last year on the Saturday night for the wildcard game, and it set streaming records, they're now interested in the narratives and the storylines. And again, pulling from the interview that he did with you guys, talking about, what does this game sound like? It feels like a Monday game. It sounds like a Thursday night game, but it can't be week one. It's all about the narratives and the stories and how many times they can put teams on the different primetime spots to sell more games, to drive up the ratings. And rest, while it might be part of the calculus, is far, far down. And it's mainly reserved for kind of what he said, where he mentioned, well, you don't want a team to have like 2 mini buys and a bye week before week 8. You'd like them to be spaced out a little bit more, some later, some earlier. Well, if you care about rest in that situation, why don't you care about rest overall? The other thing I would say is it's unfair for a team like the San Francisco 49ers to get screwed last year with the negative 20-day net rest edge and then get screwed again this year with a negative 21-day net rest edge. So if you're not going to even try to balance it within a season, at least try to help the teams that got hurt by it last year to make them feel a little bit better this upcoming season. So there are just a number of things that I feel are unfair from an NFL scheduling perspective that they're not doing intentionally to certain teams, in my view. They're just not really putting those guardrails and caring about factoring these elements in to the schedule. And some of them, Ross, are going to be impacting player health and safety once we start talking about the 3 games in 10 days, which is something we need to hit on at some point here. There's just a lot of issues that I have with this year's schedule. And again, I think their hands are tied. I don't think they're doing anything maliciously. I think it's just the edict.
So I got 2 things, one for me and one for Steve. First thing I would tell you, Warren played for 5 teams. Every GM and head coach you talk to, winning and competitive advantage, disadvantage is their number one concern. I'm not breaking news here, but that is not every owner's number one concern. It is not. And so I believe that the NFL is probably doing what the owners ultimately want them to do. What I don't understand what that is, they have like a zillion computers spitting this thing out. They could put in there rest disadvantage inputs into the computer. You could help them, Warren, and they could still spit out a really good TV viewership schedule without as much disparity if they put in there, hey, teams can't have more than 3 games where they've got this rest disadvantage, or they can't have more than a 3-day. They could put those inputs into the computer program and still spit out hundreds of playable schedules that would be great for TV. Steve, my question for you is, based on what Warren's telling us, with the 65% and the 55%, why do we not read Warren's article and go bet right now at DraftKings Sportsbook using code Ross on every team that has a 3-day or more advantage in every one of those games?
Well, I think you've got to go and look at your power ratings and see, did DraftKings indeed adjust for those rest advantages and disadvantages? If they didn't adjust and they're just basing on the power rating, then absolutely. Yeah, get in front. We talk about this all the time. Why make a bet in, let's see, I think it's May. Yeah, we're in May. And they don't play till October. Why am I going to tie up my money for that period of time? Because I'm going to bet a number if both teams meet expectations that I'll never, ever, ever see again. And I largely agree with that. So the answer is yes, we absolutely should do this. You know, I hate to say it as a professional bettor, I love schedule inequities. I love teams getting screwed. I love great spots for some teams. I wish there was more of it, frankly. I'm thrilled that the USC has to play at Rutgers. You know, that's my kind of situations when I look at scheduling and how it impacts the point spread.
And I think we're going to get more of them, Steve, because they don't seem to care. You know, Mike said, unless I'm proved otherwise, I don't care. And they've got their guys who are crunching these numbers. You're right, Ross. They could come up with a decent schedule, and it would take them, 5 days to run all the, run it through. Instead, it takes them weeks and weeks to come up with the schedule. Why is that? Because so much of it is about the narrative and the storylines and how do we know where this player is going? Well, we don't know that yet. So let's wait. We got to figure it out. So then we can build in this great storyline about this revenge game or whatnot and put it in prime time and make our sponsors happy. And I understand that from your point of view from the owners. Although I will tell you, I spoke directly to an owner, not this year, but last year, who took some of my stuff and sent it to the league because he was upset. And some of these guys, they don't know about these things. They have hunches about it. Like one guy didn't realize how many times that his team was going on the road in primetime games and they were hardly ever hosting them. And he wanted to host some more primetime games. So, but it's mainly that I don't talk to owners nearly as much as I talk to coaches or GMs. And if you ask any of them, you yourself, Ross, as a player, would you rather have a schedule where you were the team that had the plus 16 rest edge, or you were the team that had the minus 21 day rest edge? Obviously, everybody's going to be picking the plus 16. If you were the player and said, hey, a team's going to play on a Thursday, and then they're going to have a whole mini bye, whereas you're going to be playing an opponent that's coming off of a Monday game on a short week, and they have to go on the road to play that other team that was on the Thursday. So those two teams are matching up against one another. Every single player is going to want to be playing at home with the extra rest against a team who's on short rest. So players know that rest matters and is important to them. Coaches care about it. Like you said, the struggle to get every single competitive advantage possible. Why the league in the scheduling department is suggesting that rest doesn't matter that much is pretty silly to me, but this is what we're talking about.
And what I thought was so interesting is, and Steve, I don't know if you got a chance to watch or listen, they're very well aware of Warren, and they, Michael Norris said, we have to be, because, if Warren's coming up with these numbers, then people are talking about it. And if they're talking about it, then we need to be aware of it. And clearly Warren, the teams, especially if it does not favor them, I bet you the Ravens aren't complaining about it this year at plus 16, but the Niners might be. And they probably say the Niners, well, you had the same thing last year and you were in overtime in the Super Bowl. So didn't seem like it bothered you all that much. It is interesting to me that they're very well aware of it, yet it's still not as much of a priority. And, I feel like, Warren, if they felt like it was really moving the betting lines and people were really winning a lot from it, I feel like they would adjust it more. And it feels like their research tells them, I only have 10 seconds here, Warren, but it feels like their research tells them that is not the case. This happens, by the way, every time Warren comes on. I'll be begging him to come on a second time because we never have enough time. Here's the thing. For the specific teams this year, maybe I'll get Warren on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast at some point later in the offseason. You got to read his article, okay? It's Sharp Football Analysis, Warren.
Yeah, sharpfootballanalysis.com.
Sharp Football Analysis. Follow him on social media at Sharp Football. Then you'll get the specific team data for this year. We talked a little bit more macro this year than specifically micro. He's Steve Fezzik. I'm Ross Tucker. That was incredible. I knew it would be. Good luck, everybody. Hope you guys win some money.
Thanks for tuning in to Even Money. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.